Long-term mental health problems develop through experiences and the memories of those experiences. And as you chain those memories together, you start to create a narrative story about yourself and about how you are in the world. And this story often incorporates perceived weaknesses, faults or failings. So for instance, you might say, oh gosh, I've always been a worrier, or I was anxious as a kid. You might say, oh gosh, I've got to do things really, really well, otherwise it just doesn't feel right. It just feels wrong, it feels like I'm failing somehow. You might say, oh, I always feel like an imposter or a fraud. So these stories that you tell yourself gain increasing power over time, therefore perpetuating and deepening the mental health problem that you might struggle with. And these stories create opportunities to demonstrate themselves to you. So for instance, you might say, oh, I couldn't possibly go into a crowd because I might have a panic attack. You might say, I never speak up at work because I might get criticized, and that would make me feel like I was just failing, or I might get seen, exposed as being a fraud. I never push myself forward, and I don't really have many friends because I don't feel good enough about myself. So the stories that originally get created through memories and experiences create opportunities for these memories and experiences to be reinforced. And in so doing, what actually happens is we start to mistake emotional experiences to be emotional facts. And we start to believe even more strongly these negative stories that we tell ourselves. Now, this situation can perpetuate itself for years or decades until often there's an inner psychic shock. An inner psychic shock could be something, typically it would be something like a burnout experience at work, through stress, through these dynamic negative stories just coming to fruition to the point where you just can't cope anymore. Or a significant mental health episode such as a panic attack. Or a relationship fracture where the prospect of loss is just too difficult to bear. Anyway, this inner psychic shock pushes you into finding some form of therapy to help with things. And the form of therapy that I offer is Self Help CBT or CBT. And typically, through a course of treatment, we come to modify and correct the negative stories because they're distorted and unbalanced and just not adaptive actually for the world in which you live. We refine and we change these stories so that they're more useful. And what happens is, therefore, that the mental health problems go away. They get eradicated. Panic, anxiety, depression, stress are entirely optional aspects of life, in my opinion, because after a course of CBT therapy, it's quite common that people are not anxious and they no longer have panic attacks. They're not depressed. And I often teach people how to be not stressed at work, because stress is definitely an option. Now, I think a sad fact is this. Because these narrative stories and these, in a sense, mental health problems can persist for years or decades, you always get a poorer quality of life, in a sense. So if you've been anxious for many years, or if you've been depressed for many years, you by definition have a much poorer quality of life than you might have otherwise. And therefore, a process of treatment might give you a level of functioning that you haven't experienced for ages and ages and ages. And doesn't it seem a shame to have put off seeking out help until the inner psychic shock became such an overwhelming experience that you had to find some help? Now you might say to me, what's your evidence that I am running a wrong story, an unhelpful, maladaptive, incorrect, distorted story of my life experiences? Because for me it feels true. My answer would be this. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people have been through CBT therapy and they've changed their lives, right? The stories that they believed about themselves, they've recognized them to be untrue and they've changed the narrative and they've got on a different path. And each one of those people is evidence that if you struggle with a mental health problem such as panic, anxiety, depression or stress, you can resolve that and move past this problem. But to do that, you have to change the story that you tell yourself, because that then gives you the opportunity to have different emotional experiences and to cope with different emotional experiences differently. With depression, it's very common that people underestimate their strengths and resources and they overestimate their faults and failings. This is a distorted narrative. With anxiety problems, it's very common that people overestimate the threat that they're under and they catastrophize about their ability to cope and manage with things that haven't happened. We need to modify that so that in the end, you're more accurately calibrated to external reality, and therefore you feel stronger about yourself and you feel more able to manage the experiences that you have. Now my suggestion is, rather than wait for an inner psychic shock to drive you into therapy, why not think about making some changes that make your life more adaptive and beneficial now? My suggestion is to use Self Help CBT, Self Help Cognitive Behavior Therapy. The tools of the therapist are the things that you go to therapy for. And Self Help CBT gives you all of the tools of the therapist without you having to have a therapist, and therefore puts you in charge, puts you in control of the journey to wellness. If you want to learn more about Self Help CBT, visit Drpurves.online, and you'll find that the Anxiety Wizard program, which will teach you to be your own therapist, is there and it's free to start. I look forward to seeing you on the inside of Anxiety Wizard.